The phone rang at 3:47 a.m. in Maria Gonzalez's cramped Caracas apartment, cutting through the oppressive August heat like a blade. The sound pierced through her restless sleep, jolting her awake in the darkness of yet another power outage. Her hands trembled as she fumbled for the device, knowing with the certainty of someone who had lived through too many crises that no good news ever came at this hour. Her brother Carlos's voice cracked through the static, hollow and defeated in a way she had never heard before. "Maria, the bank froze everything, every account, every bolivar. They're saying it's sanctions compliance." His words came in short, desperate bursts. 23 years I worked for that company. 23 years of savings, pension contributions, everything we built for the kids' education, gone. Outside her grimy window, the once proud skyline of Venezuela's capital looked like a mouth with missing teeth. Empty office towers stretched toward the darkened sky like concrete graveyards, their windows dark and lifeless. The telecom tower, once a symbol of Venezuelan technological ambition, now stood as a monument to broken promises. Streetlights flickered sporadically, casting eerie shadows across abandoned construction sites where billion-dollar projects had simply stopped. The sound of distant sirens echoed through the valley, mixing with the ever-present hum of private generators, the only reliable electricity source for those who could afford fuel. In the apartment below, Mrs. Rodriguez cried softly, probably over another family member who had joined the exodus northward. This wasn't just another economic downturn or normal recession. Maria knew she was witnessing something far more sinister, the most sophisticated financial heist in modern history, executed not with guns or bombs, but with spreadsheets, compliance forms, and bureaucratic warfare. A nation that once floated on an ocean of black gold was drowning in its own wealth, and the drowning wasn't accidental. Rewind to December 15, 1999. Hugo Chavez walked up the marble steps of the Miraflores presidential palace wearing his trademark red beret. Venezuelan voters had handed him the keys to a kingdom that wasn't just rich, it was obscenely wealthy. Beneath Venezuelan soil lay 300.8 billion barrels of proven oil reserves, larger than Saudi Arabia, Russia, and Iraq combined. At current market prices, that represented more than $20 trillion worth of hydrocarbon wealth, enough to buy Apple, Microsoft, and Amazon twice over. By 2000, Venezuela pumped 3.2 million barrels daily, generating over $100 billion annually. Carlos Ramirez, Maria's brother fresh from engineering school, landed a petroleum services job paying $2,800 monthly, more than most American college graduates earned. He bought a new Toyota Camry, moved into a modern apartment in Los Mercedes, and planned for a limitless future. "We felt invincible," Carlos would later tell his sister. "Every month brought more oil revenue. Every year meant bigger projects. The government invested in schools, hospitals, universities. We thought it would last forever." Venezuelan families vacationed in Miami and Paris. Shopping malls in Caracas rivaled those in Houston. The bolivar was strong against the dollar. Oil revenues poured into social programs and infrastructure. Venezuela bankrolled allies from Bolivia to Nicaragua, challenging American influence across Latin America. But Chavez made a fatal miscalculation. He began selling oil in euros, yuan, and rubles instead of dollars. In 2006, Venezuela announced plans to create a regional currency for Latin American trade. Chinese companies received massive contracts paid in renminbi rather than dollars. Venezuelan delegations signed deals in Beijing, Moscow, and Tehran. American oil executives watched from Houston boardrooms with growing alarm. ExxonMobil, operating in Venezuela since the 1920s, found itself locked out of new projects. Chevron saw market share declining as PDVSA prioritized Chinese and Russian partnerships. For the first time since World War II, a major oil producer was seriously challenging the post-war financial architecture that made American economic dominance possible. In Washington's corridors, alarm bells rang. Venezuela had forgotten the most important lesson of modern geopolitics. You can have oil or you can challenge American financial power, but you cannot do both for very long. The beauty of modern financial warfare is its deniability. Unlike traditional military campaigns with obvious invasions and bombing runs, economic warfare operates in banking shadows, hidden beneath layers of bureaucracy, compliance procedures, and regulatory frameworks that few people understand and even fewer can challenge. The operation against Venezuela began quietly in 2015, though groundwork had been laid years earlier. The blueprint was simple. Venezuela would be strangled, not through military action or obvious sanctions, but through patient financial pressure. U.S. banks received enhanced due diligence guidance suggesting Venezuelan transactions posed elevated money laundering risks. Starting in 2015, every Venezuelan transaction suddenly required 3 approval levels, extensive documentation, and risk assessments taking weeks to complete. Here's how the noose worked. Every international bank operates through correspondent relationships with American institutions. To want to trade Venezuelan oil to China, Chinese banks need dollar clearing access controlled by American banks. Want German medical equipment? Manufacturers need letters of credit from banks that guarantee payment. Treasury officials pressured major banks to classify Venezuelan transactions as high risk. JP Morgan Chase, Bank of America, and Citibank began closing Venezuelan accounts. European banks followed. Venezuela found itself financially isolated, unable to conduct basic international commerce despite sitting on the world's largest oil reserves. The pressure escalated in 2017 when Trump signed Executive Order 13,808, prohibiting U.S. financial institutions from Venezuelan government debt financing. But devastation came from how private institutions interpreted this order. Banks classified virtually all Venezuelan transactions as potentially sanctioned. The genius was plausible deniability. When Venezuelans complained about economic warfare, American diplomats pointed to narrow official sanctions. The broader devastation came from private companies making independent decisions to avoid regulatory risk. Venezuelan businesses couldn't import spare parts because banks wouldn't process payments. Medical clinics ran out of equipment because manufacturers couldn't secure payment guarantees. Most devastatingly, Venezuela's oil industry began collapsing. By March 2018, the effects were no longer invisible. They were written on the faces of every Venezuelan forced to choose between buying food and buying medicine. They echoed in empty hospital corridors that could no longer afford basic supplies. They manifested in a daily exodus of desperate families walking across the Colombian border with backpacked belongings and shattered dreams. Maria Gonzalez watched her comfortable middle-class life disintegrate in real time. Her job as hospital administrator became increasingly impossible as medical suppliers worldwide stopped accepting Venezuelan payments. The oncology ward where she worked ran out of chemotherapy drugs because pharmaceutical companies couldn't get payment guarantees from Venezuelan banks. I had to tell a 12-year-old girl with leukemia that we couldn't continue her treatment, Maria would later recount, her voice breaking, not because the medicine didn't exist, not because we didn't have money to pay for it, but because banks in Switzerland wouldn't process payment from our government's health ministry. They said it violated U.S. sanctions compliance. A child's life was ended by a computer algorithm in a bank she had never heard of, in a country she would never visit. Carlos S. engineering company collapsed in slow motion throughout 2018. Projects planned for years were suddenly halted when European equipment suppliers demanded payment in advance, something Venezuelan companies could no longer provide because their banks had been cut off from international wire transfer systems. His company's German business partners apologized repeatedly, explaining their banks required additional risk assessments that could take months to complete. The numbers tell only part of the story. Venezuelan oil production collapsed from 3.2 million to under 800,000 barrels daily by 2019, but human reality was far more devastating. An estimated 40,000 people died from preventable diseases between 2017 to 2019 because they couldn't access medicines readily available in neighboring countries. Over 300,000 children suffered malnutrition as food imports plummeted. Hyperinflation reached 1,000,000% annually, meaning money saved Monday was worthless Friday. People began weighing paper currency instead of counting it because bills had become so voluminous and worthless. ATMs ran empty because withdrawing the equivalent of $20 required wheelbarrows full of bills. Elena Morales, a Caracas teacher, described daily humiliation. I got paid Friday morning and immediately rushed to grocery stores because by Saturday the same money bought half as much. My salary was 8 million bolivars monthly, which sounds like a lot until you realize it was worth about $12. I was college educated, and I couldn't afford chicken for my family. Over 7 million Venezuelans fled their homeland between 2015 to 2022. Roughly 1/4 of the entire population. This wasn't migration, it was mass exodus comparable to the Syrian refugee crisis. Families that had lived in the same communities for generations found themselves walking across international borders with nothing but the clothes on their backs and hope that somewhere else would offer them a chance to survive. While Venezuelan families struggled to find their next meal and millions fled their homeland, different narratives unfolded in Houston boardrooms, Manhattan trading floors, and Washington, D.C. government offices. Venezuela's collapse was a humongous humanitarian disaster. It was the largest business opportunity in the Western Hemisphere. American financial firms quietly accumulated Venezuelan debt securities at massive discounts. Goldman Sachs famously purchased $2.8 billion worth of Venezuelan bonds for approximately $865 million, less than 31 cents per dollar. When Venezuelan opposition leaders criticized the transaction as unethical profiteering from human suffering, Goldman's response was telling. This was a legal, market-based transaction. Greylock Capital, Elliott Management, and dozens of other hedge funds began building massive positions in Venezuelan debt, betting that future governments would be forced to honor these obligations at full value. The mathematics was simple. Buy Venezuelan bonds for pennies, wait for government collapse, then demand payment from whoever replaced them. By 2020. International creditors held over $150 billion in Venezuelan debt securities purchased at fractions of face value. Venezuelan taxpayers would eventually be required to pay full amounts of wealth transfer from one of Latin America's poorest populations to some of the world's wealthiest investment firms. Oil companies repositioned with equal cynicism. While Venezuelan oil workers lost jobs and production facilities deteriorated without maintenance, American energy companies began developing detailed plans for post-crisis reconstruction of Venezuelan energy assets. Chevron maintained minimal presence throughout the crisis, quietly expanding technical teams and updating geological surveys. ExxonMobil, forced to abandon Venezuelan operations in 2007, started lobbying State Department officials about ensuring proper stewardship of Venezuelan energy resources. ConocoPhillips hired former Venezuelan oil executives who had fled to Houston, building expertise for what they euphemistically called future opportunities. Venezuelan state assets were systematically transferred to American control through legal mechanisms most Venezuelans could understand or challenge. Citgo, Venezuela's most valuable overseas asset and operator of 3 major U.S. refineries, was placed under Juan Guaido's parallel government control, a political entity the United States recognized as legitimate, despite controlling no Venezuelan territory and commanding no military units. British courts ruled that $1.95 billion worth of Venezuelan gold belonged to Guaido's government, not the government actually controlling Venezuelan territory. The gold would remain frozen while Venezuelan hospitals ran out of basic medical supplies. Private military contractors developed security assistance proposals. Financial markets created Venezuela reconstruction bonds, allowing traders to literally gamble on human suffering. Today, as Maria works 3 grueling jobs in Bogotá just to send $15 monthly back to her elderly parents in Caracas, the true scope of this financial operation becomes impossible to ignore. Carlos managed to escape to Houston in 2021, where he now works as junior technician for an American oil services company at 1/10 the salary he earned in Venezuela. The bitter irony is unlost on him. He is helping the same companies that destroyed his homeland prepare for their eventual return to Venezuelan oil fields. His new colleagues speak openly about reconstruction opportunities and resource optimization, as if discussing whether rather than systematic destruction of his country. They have organizational charts showing how Venezuelan oil production could reach 4 million barrels daily within 5 years of political transition. Carlos reports during weekly phone calls to Maria. They know exactly which fields to develop first, which refineries need upgrading, which ports require expansion. They've been planning this for years. Venezuela's proven oil reserves remain largely untapped. That $20 trillion in hydrocarbon wealth still sitting underground while the nation above struggles to keep hospital generators running. But infrastructure to extract that wealth, built with Venezuelan labor and investment over decades, now sits idle or has been legally transferred to foreign control. This isn't just a Venezuelan tragedy, it's a blueprint tested and refined from Iran to Russia, from Syria to Myanmar. The ability to exclude entire nations from dollar-based financial systems has become America's most powerful weapon, more devastating than any military intervention and more politically sustainable than traditional sanctions. The Venezuelan operation proved that determined coalitions of financial institutions, government agencies, and multinational corporations could systematically destroy a nation's economy without firing a single shot. More importantly, they could accomplish this destruction while maintaining plausible deniability about their intentions and methods. The pattern is consistent. Target the nation's access to international financial systems. Wait for economic collapse, then position American and allied companies to extract resources and rebuild infrastructure under terms favorable to foreign investors. Iran learned this when oil exports collapsed under banking sanctions. Russia discovered it when major banks were expelled from SWIFT systems. Venezuela demonstrated that no country is too large or resource-rich to be financially destroyed if it challenges American economic dominance. The next time you hear politicians or media figures discussing sanctions for democracy or financial pressure for human rights, remember Maria's 3:47 a.m. phone call. Remember Carlos working for companies that destroyed his homeland. Remember millions of Venezuelan families scattered across Latin America, driven from their homes not by war or natural disaster, but by calculated financial engineering of institutions that profit from their suffering. Economic warfare has human faces, real families, actual consequences rippling through generations. In our interconnected world, controlling the financial system means controlling everything else: governments, economies, societies, and ultimately, human lives. The oil is still there, waiting underground in the Orinoco Basin and Maracaibo Basin. $20 trillion worth of hydrocarbon wealth that belongs to the Venezuelan people but will likely be extracted by foreign companies for foreign benefit. The largest ATM in the Western Hemisphere, waiting for the right people with the right access codes to start dispensing wealth. The only question now is how many other nations will suffer Venezuela's fate before the world understands that this financial weapon represents an existential threat to any country that dares challenge American economic supremacy. Venezuela was the test case. Every other resource-rich nation was watching, learning, calculating whether independence is worth the price Venezuela ultimately paid. The answer, written in the tears of 7 million Venezuelan refugees, seems to be that it's not.